Hello, listeners. Mallory Wilsey here, Chief Producer of the Enrollify Network, and I want to take just a quick moment to tell you about another show on our podcast network that I think you'll love. Confessions of a Higher Ed Social Media Manager is your ultimate guide to understanding the do's, don'ts, and complexities of the higher ed social media ecosystem. Host Jenny Lee Fowler from MIT brings her expertise and passion for social media to the table. Each episode offers a deep dive into real-world examples, dissecting what worked, what didn't, and identifying valuable lessons along the way. You'll get the key insights and tips to help you elevate your own social media game. Make sure your social media efforts hit the mark every time. Subscribe to Confessions of a Higher Ed Social Media Manager by visiting podcast.enrollify.org or search for it wherever you love to listen to podcasts.
Hi, I'm a higher ed CMO, and I have a confession to make. I actually really enjoy doing student journey mapping, even though it is a massive undertaking. And if you do it right, you're involving dozens of people in the project. I love how it involves taking principles of design thinking or human-centered thinking and applying that to solving a challenge that I think can really move the needle for recruitment and retention and student success. So I'm so thrilled to have my colleague and friend Joey Schmidt, who is at NYU, on the show to talk about his experience with student journey mapping. I hope you enjoy. Welcome to Confessions of a Higher Ed CMO, a podcast that empowers higher ed marketers to bring innovation, creativity, and excellence to their work. I'm your host, Jaime Hunt. Join me every 2 weeks for discussions with some of the best minds in higher education marketing. Confessions of a Higher Ed CMO is part of the Enrollify Network, a robust collection of podcasts designed to help higher educational professionals like you grow. Explore our other shows at enrollify.org or check out some of my personal favorites linked in the show notes below. Enrollify is made possible by Element 451, the leading AI-powered all-in-one student engagement platform, helping institutions create meaningful, personalized, and engaging interactions with students. Learn more at element451.com. I'm absolutely delighted to be here with Joey Schmidt, who is the Associate Vice President of Global Enrollment Marketing and Communications at NYU, which I had the pleasure of visiting in March and absolutely loved. Joey, how are you?
Great, Jamie. It's so great to be here with you, and it's great to meet you a few weeks on campus. It's great to reconnect.
It's truly a unique campus. It's just in the heart of New York City.
It is. We really like to say we're in and of the city. We have our main kind of hub is in Washington Square, which is absolutely beautiful. We also have our School of Engineering is in Brooklyn, and we also have a medical corridor that's in Midtown. So we are truly in and of the city.
I loved it. It was so vibrant and just very like New York.
Yeah.
I loved it.
And I couldn't believe that was your first time to New York too. So it was a delight to show you around a little bit.
Yeah, it was wonderful. My mom went up with me and we went and saw a show and did all the New Yorky things, but I'll have to come back because I scratched the surface of New York City.
You did.
Yeah.
Well, you can always come back. That's the good thing.
I would love to come back sometime. So let's jump right into the content of this episode with the question I ask everybody. Tell us a little bit about your higher ed journey.
Well, I would say, I think like a lot of us in the profession, my path has not been a straight line, which in some ways I'm really grateful for. I got my degree in communications and media from Arizona State, and I moved right after college. I moved out to New York City to pursue film and media. And in my early days in New York, I was able to work with a film production company and got to produce a bunch of low budget, I would call low budget being kind of shoestring budget films, which was really a great way to discover New York City, but also to learn how to tell stories on a very limited, with limited means. At the same time, I also, as a day job, I was working at Disney, where I got to be a part of a team that was running promotional campaigns for movies that were coming out in the tri-state area. And I think it was early on in my career, I realized I could blend my interest in storytelling and filmmaking with a career in marketing. I made my leap to higher ed. A couple years later, a friend told me about a job opening where I am now at NYU in the business school. And NYU is a school I'd always admired for being really innovative and kind of non-traditional, also very global. I also came from a family that really valued education. My mother was a teacher. My aunt Joan is a professor at UW-Madison.
Oh, cool.
And so it had always been there with me and my family. Of course, my family thought I was going to NYU because Felicity had gone there. And there might have been some truth to that. But I really, since then have gravitated to roles in education. That includes working at the business school, supporting their marketing efforts. I led a marketing group at BRIC, which is a Brooklyn-based arts nonprofit that provides platforms to artists, but also offers free and low-cost education to Brooklyn residents. And then now the last several years, I've been working more centrally, really at the heart of NYU, overseeing global enrollment marketing strategy across not just our campus in New York, but we have global degree granting campuses in Abu Dhabi and Shanghai. So the one thing I like to say is as our elevator pitch for our team is that we use evidence and stories to support the full student life cycle from NYU hopeful through to graduation. And so I think in many ways, my career journey has not been linear, but I think storytelling and creativity has been a constant.
I love that you get to work with the Abu Dhabi and Shanghai campuses. Have you gotten to visit those campuses?
I have.
I'm
yeah.
so jealous.
Well, there's nothing like it. I mean, they're both so distinctive from New York and amazing places to visit. I'm actually going out. We have a brand new campus that just opened in Shanghai. I'm going out there in a couple of weeks. So it's really interesting to see some of the differences, but also some of the similarities that we see across the students that go to these campuses.
I love it. I love it. So today we're talking a little bit about a project that you and your team recently undertook to map the student journey. And that's a project that we just wrapped up on my campus too. So I was
great.
Super excited to hear your story. And when I posted about wrapping up my project on LinkedIn, I got flooded with please do a podcast, please do a podcast. And I was I perfectly coincide having this interview with you.
Good timing.
With that. So tell us a little bit about your project.
I should start by mentioning that we have, and I'm sure you can agree with this, we have great partners on campus that have been doing student success and student affairs work for a long time, and both centrally and at the school levels. And we're the largest private research institution in the country, so their role has always been to make this big place feel a little bit smaller. And my team came in a little bit new to this space. Up until just a few years ago, our marketing group was primarily focused on enrollment marketing, brand positioning, getting students interested in the institution. And our senior vice president for enrollment a few years ago asked us to scale up to figure out how do we support students when they're here on campus. And that meant kind of two things. One is working with offices like financial aid and the registrar and student success that really just didn't have communications capacities built in. But also, how do we look broadly across the university and looking at what are the real moments that matter for students that might even be out of our purview, but where we could partner with other offices to support them. So it was a really exciting shift for our team from attracting students to actually delivering on the promises that we make in our marketing. And I think you probably experienced this, Jaime, where, if the prospective student experience is done well, it's super seamless and coordinated and well branded, and you have, hyper personalized messages. But post-admissions, especially at large institutions, things become fragmented, and there's literally hundreds of people that have access to email to send out to students
Yes.
or to send text messages to. And so one of the students in a focus group said that at times it felt like a tsunami of services because
Wow.
things weren't coordinated enough. And I think we found to be true across a lot of institutions. So one of the first things we had to do is just try to understand the rationale for this work. Why now? Of course, students right now greatly impacted by COVID. They don't know a world before smartphones. They're living in these hyper personalized worlds of Netflix and Spotify and one-click shopping. And so we started just with a sense of humility and being really curious. We need to understand students better. And so we started with two guiding questions. The first one was, how might we create a nuanced understanding of the first year experience so we can show up with better designed services and technologies, communications. And the second one was more of a process questions. And that's where I think that gets to this idea of design thinking or human-centered design is, how do we shift the power by bringing students, underrepresented communities, other stakeholders to the table into this design process in a really meaningful way. And that meant not just designing for students, but designing with students. And we were really lucky. We had an opportunity to engage the design firm IDEO on the research part of this project. And for those that aren't familiar with IDEO, they didn't invent design thinking, but they became a really early leader in human-centered design, applying it to a whole variety of contexts, including education. We brought them in to help us, give us some structure and to help us create a methodology for doing a different kind of research together. And so I'm sure we'll get into the nitty gritty of the project, but at the outset, we started with, let's make sense of the data. Let's do some design research to really go a bit deeper. And so some of the deliverables included some guiding principles to apply to other projects, a student journey map that identifies key moments that matter in their first year where we could show up with potential solutions or interventions, and finally, some actionable concepts that we could prototype and test with students.
I love that. And I love that you used design thinking or human-centered design principles for this. I've been such a fan of IDEO since, I don't know, forever, at least, 10 or 12 years. We had a MFA in design thinking at the institution I was at.
Very cool.
And I still want to do it. I keep thinking to myself, like, if I would have started it then, I'd be long done by now.
Yeah.
But, I didn't. But I love that idea of design thinking and the way that it puts sort of empathy and understanding and the end user right at the center of what you're trying to accomplish. But tell me a little bit more about how you did that.
Sure. Yeah. Empathy is a big part of it. We decided to start with the research. After all, we're research institutions, and that's also incredibly helpful for getting buy-in, from our campus partners. And so before we even tapped IDEO, we started by just talking to folks outside of our division and said, what data do we already have that can tell us, to give us some insights into the student experience that might inform our research questions and our methodology? It was really helpful to do that, just to get buy-in and to form relationships. One of the big reveals was that, actually not that surprising, but our data just lives in so many different places. And so something that's come out of this project is we need to find more ways to surface and be more transparent about the data that we have and share more frequently. So all this data that included, recent focus groups or student satisfaction surveys or exit surveys, pulse surveys, all of that came together to help us inform our methodology. Design research is something we hadn't really done before in this capacity. And design research is, for us, was really the first part of the design thinking process. And that's essentially taking a more ethnographic approach to our research and to really understanding student behaviors. And what I love about the design research process is that your team becomes the research instrument. Mm-hmm. And so that means, also a very big shift from treating your students as the experts of their experience. And oftentimes when we're doing focus groups, there's this kind of power dynamic that exists. Maybe you're buying them pizza, but it's still their students. And this was really a big shift in how we viewed students and how we treated them, even the questions that we would ask, and treating them as equals throughout this process. And to start, we cast a very wide net. We had a screener questionnaire that went out to thousands of first-year students to make sure that we were really having diverse perspectives included. So looking at not just demographics, but lived experiences and different identities, where students were coming from, different identity groups. And in the end, we had about 500 students participating across the research and the co-design. So it had really good representation. And I'll just share a few of the methods that were new to us that were really immersive. For example, we had some of our researchers actually shadowed students for a day and followed them into the classroom, observed them as they were taking the subway up to an event, or even reacting to something, a text message or an email that they received from a professor or one of their academic departments, and asking them, how did this make you feel? How was this experience for you? We also set up pop-up installations in our libraries, which was just a really visible way to gather rapid real-time feedback from students. So inviting students to share their stories about their first year, even junior and seniors coming back and saying, oh, I remembered this, and giving us feedback on how it went in real time. One of my favorite methods, it just is actually something that we've been continuing to this day, are called diary studies. And that's where we give students a series of questions to answer over the course of several weeks. And students can record their thoughts about, an activity or a class or an experience that they had. And what was really great about this is it allows students to submit feedback in whatever format makes sense to them. So some were, recording voice memos on their phone as they were walking to class, or recording videos after something because they just preferred that format, or of course, written text. And so not only was it great data, but it was also, it's helpful later when we're trying to tell the story of the student journey. We have these great visual, very tangible stories to pull out for different stakeholders. And then the last research part I'll mention actually does not involve students, but it's something that we now apply to almost everything. And that's called analogous research. And that's gives us the opportunity to get out of our day-to-day a little bit, and it's looking outside of our industry for inspiration. And so we looked at, in addition to some of our peers in higher ed, we were also looking at healthcare and hospitality and even government for, where are there some parallels we can draw inspiration from. And I would say we were surprised that actually healthcare gave us a lot of good ideas to chew on, because they are dealing with a lot of the same issues. So sensitive data, communicating really complex processes to patients, obviously caring for a whole diverse set of patients. And so it's also an industry that I think is ripe for disruption, like higher ed. And so we met with companies like One Medical, they're known for a very technology forward approach that's exceptional customer service, hyper-personalized. That research, I think, maybe not immediately useful in the moment, but things we remember as we're getting to the design process. So shifting gears a little bit, once we collected all that data and the student stories, we created some insights and what we call design principles to inform our future work. And they're intended to be sticky and memorable, and eventually you hope that they become a shared language you can use with your partners. And so some of the ones that stick with me, because they now show up in every meeting almost, and I think our staff even roll their eyes because they hear it constantly, but it's really helpful. One that's probably every marketer can probably align with, which is just in time over just in case. Students told us that they want resources in moments of need, not constantly. So it's helping us to move away from sending laundry lists of information, and instead of doing a long newsletter every week, making sure that we're really timely and delivering information before a critical deadline or when we know students are asking for it. Another one I loved was this idea of dialogues over monologues. And this really embodies what co-design is. And that's having conversations with students or whoever you're designing for in a way that aren't one-way streets. So actively involving them in the experience. And the last one I'll mention, which I'm sure we'll come back to, is be the glue, not the glitter. And that came out of a big insight that, our institutions are not under-resourced, they're under-organized. And so it's the idea that we need to foster collaboration across our different silos. And so I'll just mention about the co-design process just briefly. The journey map was really the first thing that we co-designed with students. So once we had all this data and resources, we started to map out key moments for students. And not surprisingly, there's no one universal moment or one universal experience that every student passes through. We're just too huge. But we did realize with the input of students that there were some universal moments that kind of serve as checkpoints that could be make or break moments during their first year. So I think right now we're all experiencing that with our yield cycle as we're releasing regular decision for admissions. And there's this I got in moment where there's these sky high expectations. They're on top of the world. They're posting their admit letters to TikTok and Instagram. But how do we show up in these moments? And what are some of the maybe information overload that they're receiving and some of the feedback we're hearing in that moment that we can show up better for? The next moment that I'll mention is where am I? Where students are arriving on campus or maybe getting ready to campus, making sense of new digital tools, new living arrangements, maybe starting their class and getting a sense of how rigorous the classroom is. And so what was really helpful with this structure was different than the kind of a typical journey map approach, which oftentimes is like an audit of every step they go through. This was taking a more broad view, but what I've appreciated about this approach, it allows us to identify places we can show up cross-functionally with interventions, as I mentioned, or new solutions to tackle together.
I absolutely love that this was just like a soup to nuts sort of thing and how involved you got the students in this. If I might ask two questions, sort of to give our listeners sort of a framework of how intensive these processes are. How long did this take you and how many people were involved?
For the journey map itself, it was part of, and IDEO introduced all this kind of fancy language to us. So design sprints is something that we use now. I know a lot of teams are using the sprint kind of agile format, which I really liked because I think sometimes we're very slow in higher ed to move on things, and working in this kind of sprint-like fashion allowed us to break kind of big complex projects into small chunks of time. And so for the co-design, for the journey map, for example, I think it was about 3 weeks, and we worked very rapidly and turned around new revisions every day. And we also worked in a number of different modalities. So we were doing some in-person sessions, but we also used Figma or Miro boards to do, virtual journey mapping as well. So from the time we had the research to when we finished the journey map, it was about 3-4 weeks, and
wow.
Faster than we normally would do it. But I think it also it forces you to make decisions a little bit more quickly as well. Mm-hmm. And, having said that, I think we have probably made some additions and iterated on it since then, but the initial deliverable was about 3-4 weeks.
That's impressive. And did you say a number of people who were engaged?
So in addition to the students, we had a representation across a number of different, both school teams as well as central partners. So this was not just enrollment management and student success, but we had student affairs and folks from housing, folks from university relations and public affairs that are running communications at the university. IT had a big presence. All in all, we had probably about 40 to 50 stakeholders involved in the project. And of that group, I would say maybe 15 were really rolling up their sleeves in the co-design sessions.
That would be sort of in alignment with what my experience has been. I've gone through this process at 2 different institutions. And I think the first one we had, it was a much smaller school. I loved that I started this at a smaller school because you get to kind of like pilot it at a school where maybe people are more used to collaborating with one another or used to rolling their sleeves up a little bit more and then scaling that up to a larger school. But I think we had, between 35 and 40 there. And our last effort, I think we had between 45 and 50 we broke ours out into 6 sub-teams that had a sub-team captain, for lack of a better term. And each captain then led an aspect of it. So we had about, like what you're saying, probably about 15 people who really rolled up their sleeves and did the work of the project. And
And
It
were
was
there,
great.
of those people, were they kind of a mix of, were there senior leaders involved in that too, or is it people at all levels?
All levels. So we had 2 of the 6 captains were associate vice presidents. And then the rest of them ranged from assistant director to director level positions. I think 1 coordinator for one of them.
Yeah.
So it was really cool to see people shine. I think the group that tackled the family experience was led by someone that just knocked it out of the park. And I was like, I am stealing her for my team. So Brittany, if you're listening, it's like, you would be fantastic on my team. And they were not all communicators either. It was a broad range of, like you're saying, stakeholders from different types of offices across campus. I think the most onerous task was auditing everything that we're sending now.
Yes.
Did you guys do that as well?
We did, yeah. But it's so worth it. Actually, one of my colleagues, even before this design process, a few years ago, did an email audit. So essentially, we created 12 dummy accounts, NYU email addresses, and monitored email over the course of a full academic year, and looking at everything from word count to the number of emails sent by each department. And it was really revealing. I mean, it was actually informed some of the questions that we ended up looking into for the journey map. It also shows you which departments are doing a really good job, and it allowed us an opportunity to lift up and shine a light on, like, here's how you do really effective email communication. And so we actually just ran it again last year. So it's nice to have some kind of historical data to compare it to. And good news is we're making some improvements in terms of the amount of emails that we're sending and getting, I think, a little bit more refined in some ways and more targeted. And, there was times where we found there's too many communications, but there was also gaps where, like, why aren't we sending more information about X policy at this time of year? So it's doing that work. It's definitely can be painstaking, but often really worth it.
Yeah. When I opened up the audit for the very first time, and it was all color coded and very neatly organized, I was so impressed with the team for completing that work. But we saw immediately one office that I'm not going to publicly shame, but my gosh, they sent out 30 emails in 1 month. So that,
I believe it.
When you have 20 business days in a month and you sent out 30 just mass emails, and some of the feedback from students, to your point about that just in time type of communication, was they just started drowning it all out.
Yeah.
Like the sheer volume of it made them ignore it, and it became like an ad, like that you see when you go to a news site or whatever and you see ads. Your brain becomes attuned to not looking at them.
Yes.
And it really did that office a disservice, I think. But it was eye-opening, I think, for that department's VP to be like, oh my gosh, like this might be why we're not getting the kind of results that we're hoping for. And this might be why the open rates are so dismal, because we're doing too much.
Yes. Yeah. Doing too much. That's a good way to put it. Well, actually, one of the design principles I didn't mention was this idea of subtract to simplify. I think too often we are doing more and more and more to address a problem, and very rarely do we reward ourselves from removing something from the process, whether it be removing something for students or even removing a step or removing a meeting from our calendar that maybe is no longer beneficial, removing an email campaign that is no longer successful. And I find that is often an overlooked strategy, because we just don't get, there's not a lot of incentives to remove.
Right. Well, and that's the thing. When you do those start, stop, continue exercises, I feel like we need to do them annually at minimum, because there's stuff that people are doing that they've done for 15 years because they've always done it.
Yeah. It's just human nature.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's like, well, we couldn't possibly not do this.
Yes.
This is outside the scope of the project that we're talking about. But when I first started at Old Dominion, we were sending out daily clips. So every day we were sending out a clip sheet. And when I asked why, it was like, well, the president wanted us to. And it turned out it was 2 presidents previous. So it wasn't the current president. And I believe it wasn't even the president before that. And when I asked our president, he was like, once a week is totally fine. So we were doing this thing every single day without asking, when the new leadership came in, what are your expectations? What are your
Yes, it's
preferences?
so important.
And it just, I think that's a piece of this process. But I'd love to talk about how you were able to get buy-in to bring people from across campus, because I definitely had to start with getting some executive sponsors to join me in promoting this as something that was worthy of time.
Yes. Yeah. And that, sometimes the stakeholder management, no matter where you work, is the biggest challenge. And I think we are fortunate. We have a senior vice president for global enrollment that really gets it. She's came in as very student-centered. We also have a president now that's, very student-centered, just really big, bold vision for student success. And so I think we had a lot of support from the top. Our senior vice president's mantra is students first, keep it simple, communicate effectively. And that's actually a big sign when we walk into the office. But
nice.
Having said that, I think, staying grounded in this kind of work, it requires discipline. And you have to constantly ask yourselves, like, am I involving students at every phase of our work? And I think oftentimes our instinct is to start projects with the department need in mind instead of thinking about what students need. And so one of the things I find is it's really helpful to just be surrounded by students when you can. And I think we have our student ambassadors sitting just across the way from us. We just eavesdrop on them constantly to hear what are they interested in, what don't they like, what do they like. And so that's really helpful. But in terms of engaging different stakeholders, I have found when you can align first on the questions, that's often we have more success than we align even on goals sometimes. Mm-hmm. And say, what should we be asking ourselves? And I found it's helpful. Of course, you're going to have your champions and your allies that you go to for everything, but also thinking about who are the skeptics that that are important to include for different reasons. And how do we convert those skeptics to become champions? And converting sometimes means really listening to their, valid concerns that they might have, and maybe refining your research questions based on their input. And then when you begin the process of co-design or whatever project it might be, bringing them into the process and allowing them to roll up their sleeves so that even if they don't agree with the final outcome, at least they had a voice in the process. And one other thing that I found to be helpful is starting projects with desirability in mind. This is something we learned early on from IDEO, which is that too often projects start with all the reasons you can't address a problem. And, especially if you have your operations team and other folks in there that are very kind of practical, essential to every project. But sometimes if you bring that mentality in too early, it can really squash creative ideas. And so I love this idea of starting with a sense of optimism and desirability, because you're going to come back to feasibility eventually. But I find that to be also very attractive to leaders to say, this is what students tell us they most desire. This is what they want. We don't have to have all the answers, but we need to design for this in mind. And that just subtle shifting in approach has been really helpful in getting different things endorsed from leadership.
Hey, it's Mallory. Exciting news. I'm hosting the Engage Summit in Raleigh on June 25th and 26th, and I'd love to meet you there. Together, we'll dive into the mind of the modern student, what fires them up, how they interact, and what they expect in today's digital age, and how tools like AI help put them in the driver's seat of their education. We have some terrific speakers, including our closing keynote, New York Times bestselling author Jeff Selingo. Sessions will dig into practical ideas and innovative strategies to get your team more student-centered and ready to adopt AI. And many of your favorite Enrollify hosts are presenting too, like Jaime Hunt, Jenny Lee Fowler, and Brian Gross. Use the discount code Enrollify50 for an extra $50 off your registration. Learn more and register at engage.element451.com. We can't wait to see you there.
I love that. I think the whole notion of getting those skeptics involved early is something that applies to just about everything that we do, from creating brand advisory groups to projects like this, to fill in the blank, any task force and committees, because I have found that when you do that, they tend to get very passionately involved.
Yes.
And I have had some of my biggest cheerleaders come out of my biggest naysayers.
That's
And
great.
it just makes such a difference to give people a voice and to let them have a space where they feel heard. And that doesn't just apply to the folks that we're designing the project for, right? It also applies to those who have to then use the tools that we build or implement the solutions that we co-create. And having those folks not be on board, you can do the most wonderful work in the world. You can create the most perfect solution to a challenge. But if they're not on board with using it and they don't use it, it goes nowhere and nothing happens.
Exactly. Yeah. It might never see the light of day. And I think people know when you're just kind of crossing them off your list. So if, you're doing market research for a brand campaign, say, okay, I'm going to interview this person as part of our discovery and then not talk to him again until the final presentation. That's usually, at least there's something, but I have found it to be much more impactful and effective if you can actually bring those people along with you and making sure that during key milestones, they have an opportunity to weigh in and kind of shape what you're designing for.
100%. And this kind of leads me to my next question, and I want to give a little context and frame around it. I was recently talking with somebody in leadership who wasn't involved in this project about the project, and they were struggling to wrap their heads around sort of the who cares. And I hate that, but it was like, why? This feels like it was maybe kind of a waste of time. How will we even know if it moves the needle? And I was trying to explain, like, one of my subgroups' whole task was to identify the metrics that we would use and the KPIs that we would use to evaluate the success of the project. But I'm curious about what metrics you're using to evaluate the success.
Yeah, it's an important question. And I think, when we're thinking about student success, there's obviously the traditional metrics, and you think about retention and all the things that influence that. And we're fortunate at NYU, we have a whole center of student success insights that's providing us with that kind of data and helping us also to make sense of data. But in consumer marketing, especially, they say that marketers are the voice of the customer. And I think similarly, especially as our team has got more involved in supporting student success, we ask ourselves, how can we become the voice of the student and with our partners across student success and other units? And I think measurement in the digital space is an area I think marketers have such critical expertise that we can inform our partners about. So it's, we can measure, the ways in which we're simplifying processes for students, reducing the number of steps or clicks it might take to take a critical action, leveraging our web analytics, our social media listening has been really powerful for us to understand if there's a policy change or a new initiative being launched. It gives us the opportunity to measure the sentiment around that, or to be able to address something in real time if there's an issue around a student initiative. Our financial aid and registrar units are using reduction in call and email volume as a metric, which surprised me at first, but I think is actually a really good performance indicator, showing that we have streamlined our communications enough that they don't need to call anymore.
Yeah.
And one other thing I'll mention is, because so much of this conversation is about stakeholder management, and it's more difficult to measure quantitatively, but are we increasing our openness to shared ownership, shared accountability in projects? And one of the things we joke about on my team is we use Asana for project management, and it's been really exciting to see more and more Asana boards being created with different departments outside of our org chart, and seeing people tagged with people I don't even know. And I think that's evidence that we are working together in new ways outside of our, traditional teams.
I've said it before on this podcast, but it's worth repeating. One of my moments of greatest pride was after we went through this project at Winston-Salem State. And there were people who did not ever work together on stuff, even though they should have been. And I'm not going to call out offices, but, there were some folks that barely spoke to each other and didn't collaborate on things. And they collaborated on this huge project, and it built that muscle memory for collaborating and that muscle memory for let's have this different approach to problem solving and to tackling a challenge that faces our institution or faces our students. And I was so proud when a few months after we finished the project that people had one of the folks was one of those grumblers, one of those like, I'm not here for this. Folks actually reached out and was like, I'd like to apply this approach to another project. What do you think? And I just was like, oh, thank you. This is amazing. And I think both of us have since left that institution. And I hope he's taken some of those concepts to another institution. But it's so simple, Joey, like working together and co-creating solutions, right? It's such a simple concept. And in higher ed, we're so siloed and we are so focused on our individual departmental goals, our individual unit goals, that we don't think about the bigger picture. And I would love to, this is kind of a nuanced sort of question, but how do you get an institution to stop focusing on, for example, like a student outcome, but instead realizing that the student outcome is a symptom of an internal dynamic that you need to address? How can an institution pivot from focusing just on that outcome and instead look at how they address the internal dynamics that impact that outcome?
Yeah, that's such an important question. And in fact, one of the biggest insights we had from the journey mapping work, and again, I think this is probably true across most decentralized institutions, that, sometimes the fractured student experience mirrors the fractured administrative experience. And so I think storytelling in this context is so important. And it means finding new ways to elevate student voices and bringing them to the table in different ways that are beyond just our dashboards and spreadsheets. And leaders at all levels are very busy, but I think encouraging them to actually roll up their sleeves and involve themselves in the research at times can be really powerful. When we've done that, we've just had so many aha moments where leaders will say, oh my God, I can't believe students reacted this way to this technology or this platform, or even what they learn about other initiatives that might be happening across the institution, like one school learning about a similar initiative in another school, or maybe a better way to run email campaigns. And also to hear from students how much they value it. I think one of my favorite quotes was from a student after a co-design session that said, this is the first time I felt heard, not tallied, meaning that she didn't feel like she was part of a survey or just a number, but actually felt like we really were understanding her and valuing her input in the process. And so, I think not just capturing the data, but finding ways to deliver that to all different, stakeholders, including leadership, is critical. And I think that's why having different formats is important. And finding ways to represent our data with one very tangible story can really help advocate for student needs.
Absolutely. I mean, I think as marketers, sometimes we forget that storytelling needs to apply to our work as well. Like we're busy telling the stories of our institution, but some of our projects need a story told around it. And I know you and I probably have been in a situation where somebody complains about something or talks about something, and they have like an N of one. It's like their neighbor's cousin's kid didn't do this or didn't get that or whatever. But I think there is value in that. It's not exactly an N of one, but when you're telling an anecdotal story that's supported by the data, it's like the anecdotal story will connect with a certain group in the audience, whereas the data will connect with a certain group in the audience. But if you miss one or the other, you're not telling the whole picture. Yeah,
that's exactly right. And I think there's been actually great studies that show that, stories are so much more impactful in terms of the recall. I heard somewhere it was like 20 times more memorable than data alone. And so when you're able to combine data with a story that reflects that data, honestly, our brains are hardwired to remember stories. And if you can make it visual and tangible, all the better. And so I think sometimes even leaders are hesitant to include stories or testimonials in their, a trustee presentation or something else. But I found that if you use them effectively, they can really help motivate people and also even tug on the heartstrings a little bit, which can be really, important.
Yeah. I mean, people connect with stories, people connect with the things that make them feel emotion. And those, like you're saying, the tugging on the heartstring, that's making people feel something. And that, to your point, helps retain memory around what you've been told. And I think it gives it more power. I can say that this office sent out 30 emails in a month span. But if you can actually talk about a student receiving this deluge of emails and how that made them feel, and I could see, I don't want to call out the office, but it's so hard not to because of the topic of it. But, it's a topic. The office is centered around a topic that's very stressful for students, right? So it's, something where I could see getting this constant reminder that you need to be thinking about this thing that's really stressful might help contribute to the stress that you're feeling and the mental health challenges that you're having. So finding a student that can speak to that, I think, can just kind of help that office see it's not just Jaime Hunt saying, or it's not just this committee or task force saying, hey, we got to do something different here. This is the real tangible impact on someone of the approach that you're currently taking.
Yeah. I think it really helps to humanize the situation. One other thing that comes to mind is you ask about, how do you celebrate the successes? How do you know you've been successful? And with a project like this. And I find that if you design the project from the beginning with a clear cadence of communications and storytelling along the way, I think it can really give you a lot of momentum whenever you're ready to bring whatever product or service you're designing for to life. So making sure you're finding moments to celebrate, not just the wins or the small moments of progress along the way, but also celebrating moments, things that you learned, things that maybe failed in one of the co-design process. Like we had one concept we were really excited about. I think it was called the Top 10. And it was this hyper-personalized mobile solution organized around like top 10 questions students might ask. And so we got it in front of students and it just like their eyes went just blank and there was very little interest. And it was funny because a lot of it was built on student data and some of what we heard in the research. But what was really great about that is we learned that students don't always want this shiny new toy. They wanted just, very basic features that were maybe part of that, but in maybe a different modality or different format. And so that's just an example of something we shared back with our campus partners that this didn't work, but this is actually where we're headed now. And so I think it's important to kind of not just to celebrate your wins, but also to celebrate what you learn along the way.
That's so true. And I like that you couched as celebrate what you learned versus celebrate your failures, because I think every failure is a teachable moment, right?
Exactly.
And if we look at it differently, if we look at it as not as like, I didn't succeed at this, but I learned something in this, I think we'll be more open to quote unquote failure.
So true.
Yeah. In this whole process of, design thinking, human-centered design, we've talked a little bit about empathy and how important it is. And, I've spoken to leaders, a lot of leaders actually, who see empathy as like just being nice versus what it is, which is really being able to see from somebody else's perspective and being able to put yourself in the shoes of somebody else. And I'm interested in your thoughts around how we can help cultivate empathy in its true, not just I'm just being nice form, but in this this critical skill that we need to really, really understand our audiences.
I love this question so much. It reminds me of a quote from Seth Godin. He said something to the effect of effective marketing relies on empathy and service. And I think that is so true. And it's important that leaders are using empathy to make decisions that are having huge impact on our communities. When we started out doing this design work, I think that was always one of the guiding principles, is how do we really empathize with our audience? And so we, at the beginning of meetings, we'd have different kind of empathy generating opportunities. So one of my favorites was actually at the outset of our journey mapping project. We had staff and faculty for about a half hour just reflect on their 18-year-old selves. And we had these prompts around, what was going through your mind when you were thinking about going to college? What anxieties did you have? What were you most excited about? Who are your best friends? What music were you listening to? And we asked everybody to share out. And it was this really humanizing moment that we had with our colleagues. It not only helped us to understand them better, but also to get in the mindset of, a first year student and to remember what that's like. And so, I think the more we can find opportunities to actually put ourselves in those environments, the better. I think that's the beauty of this more ethnographic approach to doing research, is you are the research instrument, as I said before. And so you're kind of being there next to students and shadowing them. And just by doing that, you can't help but have empathy for whatever they're going through. And I'll also say, we just hosted our annual storytelling summit, which you were so amazing at. And one of my favorite sessions, though, was we had a session with 3 different senior leaders about how we tell the story across the student journey, from enrollment and admissions through to the finish line. And so we had our leaders from alumni affairs and from enrollment, and a dean of our largest school. And what was really interesting was how much they talked about how leadership and storytelling starts with active listening. And they also mentioned that active listening doesn't happen by accident. You actually have to create the conditions to make that happen. And that means going beyond focus groups, where there often can be that power dynamic, and really rolling up your sleeves with those that you're trying to serve. And so it was really wonderful for me to see in co-design sessions, we had deans and vice presidents and AVPs and vice provosts. And I'd walk in and I'd see them at the table, around the table with these students. And we heard from them afterwards just how impactful it was for them. And so, as I mentioned, leaders don't always have the time, but, even doing that a couple of times a year can really, really stay with you and help you to keep that empathy front and center.
I absolutely love that. And I love the idea of having senior leaders really get their sleeves rolled up and interacting with students. And I also love the idea of, the participants as the research tool. I like that concept so much. And I think it's something that helps put words around what a really good best practice would be for approaching a project like this. So I adore this. If I have honestly 5 meetings with folks set up to kind of talk through, how did I tackle this project based just on that LinkedIn post. So I know there's a ton of people who have this on their to-do list of something they want to tackle. And I'd love to hear what one piece of advice you would give to somebody before they get started.
It's tough to say just one, but the one I would say is to start with a sense of curiosity. And that means starting with questions. And I've said this a couple of times, but that was a big shift for us, was to know that you don't have all the answers and that there's going to be a lot of ambiguity in the process, and to really lean into that. And one of my favorite things that we adopted from IDEO was their question framework of how might we? Mm-hmm. And I think there's this kind of inherent optimism in that question that we're not, we don't have the answers now, but we're going to get there. And it's kind of creating the shared mindset of being comfortable with nuance, comfortable with ambiguity. And they said something to us that really stood out to me, which is, you need to find a way to fall in love with the challenge or the problem, and then approaching that together. So if you can do that with a sense of curiosity and humility, it makes the whole project a little bit more inclusive and can be even more creative and lead to more breakthrough ideas.
I love that. And I would say my one piece of advice would be to bring more voices to the table and bring
absolutely.
people to the table regardless of their position in the org chart. So I know we brought in like the front desk receptionists for some offices when I did this at Winston-Salem State, because they're the ones sitting there overhearing conversations between students. They're the ones trying to figure out and triage who the students need to talk to, answering the phone calls and all the questions. Like, they're boots on the ground. I'm a VP, right? I'm in a quadrillion meetings with other VPs all day. I hardly intersect with students. I don't have all the answers. I don't know what all the students are thinking. Bring those voices to the table.
It's so important. And they too, like the students, are the experts, and it's critical that they're included. Also, on that thought, it's sometimes important that leaders step away and get out of the way.
Yep.
I find sometimes especially when you're ideating or brainstorming, being there can inhibit creativity. And so I think just knowing when your voice is not needed, or even if you're going to show up, maybe be quiet for a while and allowing other voices to be heard.
100%. I would say the same exact thing. That was definitely, I think, one of the reasons why our project was really successful is I said, Jaime Hunt doesn't have all the answers. Jaime Hunt wants to hear from you, and I'm going to leave the room and have, somebody else lead this brainstorm. Because, and I want those of you who are listening who have, leadership type titles, your words have so much extra weight, even if you don't know it. And it can really steer that conversation. If you say, even your facial expressions or your body language can signal something to people. And people are so attuned to watching and observing you that sometimes even being in the room, even quietly, can shape the conversation. Yeah. And it's so hard because we want to be there, right? But there's times for us to be there and times for us to not be.
That's such a great point. Actually, one of my favorite, I was listening to Trevor Noah a couple years ago on a podcast. This was actually shortly after he started at The Daily Show. And he was talking about the dynamic that sometimes exists in writing rooms where, maybe a head producer, or in this case, the show host would walk into a creative session or brainstorm sessions, and people would get quiet. And I think what I remember from that conversation is that was happening in the beginning, but he saw finally this culture change where he would start to enter rooms and everything would, no one would stop talking. They would go about their business and almost ignore him. And he thought, that's success when I'm not changing the dynamic in the room, and that, that creative ideas are really flourishing here, regardless of whether I'm in the room.
I love that. And I think that's when you've really, truly created a safe space, or I can't think of a better word than that. A safe space is when you can be in the room. But I want people to be really conscious of the fact that when you're working with people that are perhaps the receptionist in the financial aid office or something, they're not going to walk in having that trust in you or feeling that safe space. And so, those types of relationships are the ones where I think it's really important to be cautious as much as you can.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Well, this has been fantastic. And I know people are going to want to talk to you. I can guarantee it. Where can people find you?
Well, thanks for having me on, Jamie. It's such a pleasure. Folks can find me on LinkedIn at Joey Schmidt. And honestly, I think it's more interesting to follow my team. So I'm going to give a shameless plug for their work. Because I'm biased, but they're doing some really innovative work in terms of storytelling. So you can follow their storytelling hub at meetnyu.edu, and it's where we feature a lot of the stories about the NYU community. You can also follow them on all the social channels at meetnyu. I like to compare it to Netflix in a way. It's a mix of original content that we have professional writers and a creative team and digital student ambassadors that contribute, but we also curate and source a lot of content from our partners. So some of your listeners might enjoy some of the stories on those platforms.
I love it. And I feel like there's a whole nother episode about storytelling at some point.
I would love that anytime.
Yeah, you guys do really cool work. And like Joey was mentioning, he had a summit on his campus that I'm fully stealing. That was really cool.
Please do.
Yeah.
Oh, it's so great to have you. And I just want to add, we have a lot of fans of your podcast on my team, so they're very jealous that I'm talking to you right now.
Nice. Well, hello to Joey's team. And if you want to find me, I'm on LinkedIn as Jaime Hunt, Jaime. I am no longer using X, unfortunately. I'm on TikTok as the Higher Ed CMO, as long as you give me a lot of grace, because I haven't posted in a little while. But you can always find me also on my website at thehigheredcmo.com. And I am always eager to hear from and chat with folks. So don't be afraid to reach out. And again, this was an absolute silo busting story, a silo busting episode, I think. So a perfect way to end it is let's go bust some silos. Confessions of a Higher Ed CMO is part of the Enrollify podcast network. If you like this podcast, chances are you'll like other Enrollify shows too. Our podcast network is growing by the month, and we've got a plethora of marketing, enrollment, and higher ed technology shows that are jam-packed with stories, ideas, and frameworks, all designed to empower you to be a better higher ed professional. Our shows help higher ed marketers and admissions professionals find their next big idea and feature a selection of the industry best as your hosts. Learn from Mallory Wilsey, Seth Odell, Jenny Lee Fowler, Eddie Francis, and so many other of your favorite leaders in higher ed. Enrollify is made possible by Element 451, the leading AI-powered all-in-one student engagement platform, helping institutions create meaningful, personalized, and engaging interactions with students. Learn more at element451.com.